Hi everyone, welcome back for another themes analysis video. The theme we are studying today is violence, which as you can imagine shows up pretty regularly in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Don't forget to check out the rest of this series and my animated summary if you find this video helpful. A lot of what makes this story so well known, even today, is the violence that occurs within it. Of course, nowadays we are much more used to violence in films, books, and games, but in the 1800s where this book is set, it would have been incredibly shocking to read about the kind of horrific acts that Hyde is known for. In fact, this is really the main aspect of his character, as almost every time someone encounters him, it is through some act of violence. He is also the only character who gets physically violent with other people in this book, which makes him stand out like a sore thumb amongst the prim and proper Victorians. And it's not as if he's being provoked by the people he is violent against. The first time we hear about Hyde is Enfield's account of him crushing a little girl, saying, "The man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground." The oxymoron "trampled calmly" makes Hyde truly sound like a psychopath, as he has absolutely no remorse or empathy about hurting an innocent child, and in fact makes it seem like it's part of his daily routine. His other notable victim, Sir Danvers Carew, is described as an aged, beautiful gentleman with a very pretty manner of politeness. After some slight provocation or annoyance, Hyde decides to murder the kind old man, and not in a quick and painless way either. He clubbed him to the earth. With ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. Even to a modern reader, Sir Danvers' death is a gruesome one, and what makes it worse is that he again is an innocent victim, and not one who is able to put up a fight. Hyde certainly seems to have a type when it comes to the people he enacts violence against, as Jekyll later says that when a woman approached Hyde to sell him some lights, he smote her in the face. Women, children, and old men would typically be the last categories of people that you would think of hurting, and this really gives us a sense of Hyde's evil nature and his absolute disregard for human life. In Victorian society, Hyde's actions sharply contrast what was considered respectable behaviour. At that time, everything revolved around reputation and respectability, and acts of violence were an absolute no-no. Even raising your voice would be seen as out of line, and people tried to avoid big expressions of emotion, especially anger. So to meet or even hear about someone as casually violent as Hyde would undoubtedly make a lifelong impression on the other characters, because he is so far removed from what they are used to. For instance, when Utterson first hears about the story of Hyde trampling over the little girl, it disturbs him so much that he has nightmares about him. The figure haunted the lawyer all night, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. Utterson is described as the ideal of the perfect Victorian gentleman, the total opposite of Hyde, and therefore his violence sparks a curiosity and almost an obsession in him to find out who this person is that does not belong in their society and root them out. English people, and particularly the upper classes, consider themselves to be a civilized society, and the very existence of Hyde challenges and criticizes this. His behavior is decidedly uncivilized, and is described as almost animalistic, with terms like bestial and ape-like. Darwin's theory of evolution was a very new thing at the time this book was written, and so people had a fear that if we evolved from monkeys and other creatures, we could also revert back to that state. Stevenson plays on their fears with Hyde's incredibly violent nature, and also exposes their hypocrisy, as this uncivilized monster is not from some far-off country, but within their very own social circles, an upper-class, well-respected doctor. This shows that behind the mask of civility, many of the so-called respectable people were hiding their own dark and violent sides. Throughout the story, Hyde's acts of violence escalate, going from hurting a little girl to full-on murder. Once Jekyll allows his dark side to get a taste for violence, he is no longer the same, and even when he tries to repress it again as he had for so many years, it has the opposite effect. Jekyll says that on one occasion, "I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to." But when he returns to the form of Hyde in a moment of weakness, he realized that, "My devil had been long caged, he came out roaring." and this leads to the brutal and horrific murder of Sir Danvers. Hyde's violence is not just physical, however. He is also a perpetrator of a kind of psychological violence. He instills terror in people because they can immediately sense his evil and his capacity to do terrible things with no remorse. Like I mentioned earlier, he haunts Utterson's dreams before even meeting him, while those unlucky enough to actually witness his violence, like Mr. Enfield and the maid who watches him murder Sir Danvers, are left with horrifying memories that will never be forgotten. He is also psychologically violent towards the Jekyll part of himself, as he takes delight in punishing him whenever he tries to go back to his old self. Hyde takes over Jekyll's physical form without being called upon, first at home and then in public, forcing Jekyll to take extreme measures to keep from being caught, and eventually resulting in the death of his old friend Dr. Lanyon. Finally, when both Jekyll and Hyde must confine themselves to the laboratory, he plays nasty tricks on him out of spite, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. Although Jekyll is already in the depths of despair, Hyde pushes him to the edge with these acts of psychological violence until he finally gives up completely. Without a doubt, the theme of violence is carried heavily by Mr. Hyde in this story. But even though he is the only one to get physically violent with people, there are other instances of violence by the other characters. Surprisingly, Utterson partakes in a moment of violence at the end of the book, when he fears Jekyll has been murdered by Hyde. Until this point, he has maintained his Victorian propriety and calm rationality, but when he hears Hyde's voice coming from behind the laboratory door, he commands the butler Poole to break down the door with an axe. The scene is described vividly, as Stevenson writes, "The blow shook the building and the red baize door leaped against the locks and hinges. 4 times the blow fell, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet." We could draw similarities from this description to the description of the murder of Sir Danvers, where it says, "There was a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway." Sir Danvers' death mirrors the final act of violence by Utterson and Poole, which also symbolizes the death of Hyde, as he drinks a vial of poison while the door is being broken down. This kind of behavior from Poole and Utterson is completely out of character, and only occurs because they truly believe that Jekyll's life is in danger. However, just because Victorians suppressed their violent sides does not mean they did not exist. Mr. Enfield's account of Hyde trampling over the little girl reveals this, as he says, "There was one curious circumstance what struck me. A doctor was called to help the little girl, who was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turn sick and white with the desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best." Doctors are generally perceived as well-respected and non-violent, as they are usually the ones in charge of patching people up after incidents of violence. But even he is unable to hide his desire, not just to hurt Hyde, or to bring him to justice, but to actually kill him. And Mr. Enfield says he was like the rest of us. Everyone in that crowd wanted to be violent towards Hyde, but their sense of morality and propriety stops them from doing so. Stevenson is showing that Jekyll is not alone in having a dark side with a propensity for violence, and in fact everyone seems to have one if the circumstances are bad enough. In conclusion, violence is an integral part of this story, and is mainly carried out through the character of Hyde. Hyde enjoys violence, both physical and psychological, particularly towards innocent victims. These kinds of acts completely went against the ideals of the upper circles of Victorian society, as everyone was primarily concerned with civility and respectability. Hyde's existence is a challenge to them, especially because he is a part of Jekyll, who in turn is part of the wealthy social circles, showing that the outer perfection people portray really just hides their own dark and violent sides. Thanks for watching, guys! Stay tuned for follow-up analysis videos soon to come. See you next time!